Southern Federal University. He is from Russia. He will discuss about traumas as social interaction. Dr. Sam, now you can proceed with your talk.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Esteemed colleagues, today I would like to discuss some recent developments in the perception and the conception of trauma. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm a professor of psychology in Southern Federal University, Rostov-on-Don, and a professor of finance and a professor of psychology in CSCMS. So I would like to start by quoting from two articles. One of them was published almost 20 years ago. It was titled Emotional Numbing in Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, Current and Future Research Direction, and it was authored by Brett Litz, L-I-T-Z, and Matt Gray. It was published in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry, April 2002. The objective of this paper was this: despite being understudied and poorly understood relative to the chronic fear, anxiety, and other aversive emotional states that occur in the immediate aftermath of trauma, emotional numbing has become a core defining feature of post-traumatic stress disorder. The experience of trauma produces very intense emotions, such as overwhelming fear, horror, and anxiety, and these reactions can linger for a lifetime. Many trauma survivors also report restrictions in their emotional experience, a phenomenon most commonly referred to as emotional numbing. In contrast to previous accounts of post-traumatic emotional functioning, our model posits that individuals with PTSD have difficulty expressing positive emotions as a result of re-experiencing states. We further argue that patients with PTSD are capable of experiencing and expressing the full range of emotions that were available pre-traumatically. Our model holds that individuals with PTSD are not, in fact, emotionally numb as a result of traumatic experience. Rather, PTSD is associated with hyper-responsivity to negatively balanced emotional stimuli. Consequently, patients with PTSD require more intense positive stimulation to access the full complement of appetitive or pleasant emotional behavior. And this article started a new movement to reconceive of trauma. I would say that there are two major developments recently. First of all, the reconception of trauma, of the personality disorders, as post-traumatic conditions. We are beginning to conceive of borderline, narcissism, even to some extent histrionic and maybe psychopathy. We're beginning to reconceive of these disorders, schizoid, paranoid, as post-traumatic conditions rather than personality disorders. That's the first trend. It involves the study of dissociation among many other mechanisms. And the second trend is to understand that there are two types actually of PTSD, two types of post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, complex trauma. The first type is the externalizing type. It's when the trauma is actually projected. And so these people experience flashbacks. They experience emotional dysregulation. They act out. They decompensate. They adopt reckless behaviors, etc., etc. So they externalize their trauma in many ways. The second type of reaction to trauma is an internalizing reaction, where what happens is the trauma kills, destroys the ability to emote. There's emotional numbing, and I will come to it a bit later. I would like to read to you from an article titled Emotional Reactivity and Antisocial Behavior Relative to Post-Traumatic Stress Symptom Expression, a latent profile analysis. It was authored by Molly Miller and Monica Marcy. It was published in the Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology, Volume 47, in 2019. And it says, the study examined whether emotional reactivity was associated with violent juvenile offending in a sample of detained boys. It predicted that latent profile analysis would reveal a low reactivity group characterized by symptoms of emotional numbing and callous, unemotional traits, and a high reactivity group characterized by symptoms of hyperarousal and emotional dysregulation. It was hypothesized that the low reactivity group would have higher rates of violent offending and proactive aggression than the high reactivity group. Contrary to expectations, results indicated that the presence of both emotional numbing and hyperarousal symptoms, but not hyperarousal symptoms alone, were associated with higher rates of violent offending, CU traits, and proactive aggression. Results indicate that the risk of serious aggressive behavior and violent offending may be highest among youth who are easily provoked to respond aggressively, hyperarousal symptoms, while simultaneously able to maintain emotional detachment, elevated emotional numbing symptoms, and callous unemotional traits. So we see that post-traumatic stress disorder can induce the experience of trauma, can induce emotional numbing, can change the way we express emotions. And this is reminiscent of a disorder called alexithymia. Alexithymia is a personality trait characterized by subclinical inability to identify and describe emotions experienced by oneself and others as well. The core characteristic of alexithymia is marked dysfunction in emotional awareness, social attachment, and interpersonal relation. Now, PTSD produces what is clinically called reduced affect display. Affect is, of course, the way we display emotions. Emotion is the internal experience. Affect are the behaviors, the facial expressions, the body language that reflect the emotion that is occurring inside. So there's an internal aspect, which is the emotion, and an external manifestation of the internal aspect, and that is the affect. Reduced affect display or emotional blunting is a condition of reduced emotional reactivity. It's a failure to express feelings. Affect display is missing. Verbally, non-verbally, feelings are just not mentioned, not displayed. And it is especially so when the person discusses issues that would normally be expected to engage the emotions, to arouse and excite and otherwise generate emotions. In people with reduced affect display, expressive gestures are rare, and there is little animation in facial expression or vocal inflection. Reduced affect is very common in autism spectrum disorders, in schizophrenia, in depression, in post-traumatic stress disorder, depersonalization disorder, which is a form of dissociation, schizoid personality disorder, or of course in the case of brain damage. It's also a side effect of quite a few antipsychotic medications and antidepressants and so on. But reduced affect is not apathy, it's not indifference, it's not anhedonia. It's a lack of emotion. Anhedonia is a lack of ability to experience pleasure. Apathy is indifference, which could be cognitive indifference or value, axiological indifference. Reduced affect is when the emotions are missing, when there's no emotional expression. And we don't know, we can't really tell if the lack of emotional expression reflects a lack of emotion, there's no emotion to display, no emotion to express, or some wall, some defense, some firewall separating the underlying emotion, which is experience, and the display, expression, and manifestation of the experienced emotion. We are not sure. There are several types of blunted emotional expression. First of all, there is constricted affect. Constricted affect is a reduction in individuals' expressive range and the intensity of emotional responses. Then there is blunted or flat affect. Blunted affect is a lack of affect, more severe than restricted or constricted affect, but less severe than flat or flattened affect. The difference between flat and blunted affect is in degree. A person with flat affect has no or nearly no emotional expression. He or she may not recall at all to circumstances that usually may not react at all, to circumstances that usually evoke strong emotions in others. A person with blunted affect, on the other hand, has a significantly reduced intensity in emotional expression. And finally, there's shallow affect. Shallow affect is a little like blunted affect. For example, psychopaths, factor 1 psychopaths, they have shallow affect. It's one of the attributes of psychopathy. And a bit later, I will review the various disorders and so on. PTSD was long known to cause negative feelings, depressive moods, re-experiencing hyperarousal, etc., but it is only recently that psychologists are beginning to realize that PTSD can cause exactly the opposite. No arousal, blunted affect, decrease in feeling, no experience of positive emotions. Blunted affect or emotional numbness is a consequence of PTSD because it causes diminished interest in activities that produce pleasure. It leads to anhedonia. It produces detachment from others, attachment style, which is essentially avoidant or insecure. It restricts emotional expression and reduces the tendency to express emotions behaviorally. Blunted affect is a very difficult outcome of response to PTSD. It's a central symptom in post-traumatic stress disorders. In PTSD, the blunted affect is a psychological response to the trauma, a way to combat overwhelming anxiety that the patient feels. In blunted affect, there are abnormalities also in the brain which are associated with it. Now, blunted, shallow, constricted, and restricted affect should be distinguished from inappropriate affect. Inappropriate affect is something a bit different. Inappropriate affect involves the display of reactions that do not match the situation that one is in, or do not match one's internal state. Generally, emotions, actions, environment, circumstances, they should all be on the same page. They should all reflect and conform. They should all fit in, like in a jigsaw puzzle. But in inappropriate affect, the expression of the emotion has nothing to do with the event or the circumstance. For example, someone laughing at a funeral. Inappropriate affect is usually a symptom of some underlying physical or mental condition, but it is sometimes considered a disorder in itself. It's been described well over 100 years ago, at least, and we have great studies from the 1950s, Bloiler and others. And so Stelansky referred in 1909 to inappropriate affect as intrapsychic ataxia, A-T-A-X-I-A, ataxia. So intrapsychic ataxia. And generally, inappropriate affect was studied together with flat affect in schizophrenia. Schizophrenia was the hunting ground for breakdowns between emotion and affect. But actually, we can see similar phenomena and even of the same magnitude, for example, among psychopaths. In borderline personality disorder, when there is a transition or switching to a secondary psychopathic state. In narcissists, on many occasions. So it's wrong to think that affect, improper affect, inappropriate affect, blunt affect, etc., they're all schizophreniform disorders. They are common also among personality disorders. We know that this kind of wrong affect is caused by brain damage, neurological dysfunction, schizophrenia, psychotic disorders, medications, but also by psychological factors. And these psychological factors lead simultaneously to a breakdown between experienced emotion and the expression of emotion, and mood lability, anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, or personality disorders. The conditions involving inappropriate, shallow, blunt affect are numerous. Major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, schizoid personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizoaffective disorder, psychopathy, depersonalization, borderline personality disorder, and a host of neurological conditions, including, of course, dementia. And here are the symptoms. For example, uncontrollable crying even when not feeling sad. Recognizing that reactions are inappropriate, emotions that do not match the reality of a situation or are opposite to the reality of the situation. Showing happiness during a tragedy, for example, becoming angry without any outward provocation. Flat affect, or not showing expected emotional reactions, but not holding back emotions. There's simply nothing to show. So you see, inappropriate affect disorders, let's call them affect disorders. They are numerous. Blunted affect is common in schizophrenia, but also, for example, in psychopathy and narcissism. Restricted affect, flat affect, they're all very common. There's also labile affect. Labile affect is when people show rapid changes in emotions that don't seem to relate to any outside situations or are inappropriate for the situation. Labile affect, in labile affect, the person rapidly cycles and shifts between moods and affects non-responsively, not in reaction to anything that's happening outside, not even in reaction to anything that's happening inside, as though their emotions are so dysregulated that they spun centrifugally out of control. And this appears a lot, for example, in manic episodes, during bipolar disorder, in borderline personality disorder, and anxiety disorders, overstimulation, fatigue, and so on. Shallow affect is often used to describe the emotional experience of people with psychopathy. A person with shallow affect feels little emotion about situations that would be expected to elicit much stronger specific feelings. And this means that things that cause most people to experience negative emotions have no impact on psychopaths. For example, psychopaths experience no fear. American serial killer Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, when he heard that he is sentenced to death, he said, "Big deal, death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." That's shallow or flat affect. Now this should be distinguished from emotional numbness. Emotional numbing or emotional numbness. Everyone experiences emotional numbing or numbness at some point in life, but when it becomes a way of life, when it becomes the main dimension and determinant of emotional life, it becomes a pathology. It becomes a problem. So most people experience one emotion at any given time, and most people experience positive emotions 2.5 times more often than negative emotions. Emotions are very critical because they are a form of cognition. They sustain reality testing. They they facilitate social interactions and connectivity. But when one is overwhelmed, when one feels helpless, when one is abused or traumatized, it's very common to turn on emotional numbing. It provides a protective defense. If it is taken to extreme, it might lead, of course, to dissociation. But emotional numbing is one stage before dissociation. It provides relief. It allows to cope with hard feelings. If these hard feelings were accessible, if the emotional numbing did not set in, these hard feelings could have had very, very long-term, long-lasting consequences. So emotional numbing is a very effective defense against long-term mental health issues. And so emotional numbness, I want to quote Mayra Mendez. She's a licensed psychotherapist and the program coordinator at Providence St. John's Child and Family Development Center. And she says, emotional numbing is the mental and emotional process of shutting out feelings and may be experienced as deficits of emotional responses or reactivity. There's a temporary restriction on the capacity to feel, but it's temporary, on the capacity to feel or express emotions. She continues, while emotional numbing blocks or shuts down negative feelings and experiences, it also shuts down the ability to experience pleasure, engage in positive interactions and social activities, and interferes with openness for intimacy, social interests, and problem-solving skills. So emotional numbing, there's a price for emotional numbing, obviously. And if emotional numbing becomes a coping tool, it involves avoidance, denial, detachment, dismissal. It blocks the capacity for confronting, processing, problem-solving, and managing emotions and experiences. And the symptoms of emotional numbness include losing interest in important, once positive activities you used to enjoy, feeling distant or detached from other people, failing to access your feelings, feeling flat, both physically and emotionally, experiencing an inability to fully participate in life, having difficulty with experiencing positive feelings such as happiness, preferring isolation rather than being with others. Normally, emotional numbing is a reaction to physical or emotional pain. It's a post-traumatic reaction. The relief is temporary and allows you to move on with your life. But if this protective shield is deployed all the time, it gets in the way of connecting with other people. It gets in the way of getting in touch with feelings which are both negative and positive. So anhedonia sets in and results in anxiety and depression later on. And so the common causes like PTSD, grief, overwhelming stress, depression, physical or sexual abuse, especially egregious abuse, mental or emotional abuse, incest, substance abuse, they all lead to a form of emotional numbing. But it's for emotional numbing to be considered healthy, it must be temporary. It can be a part of post-traumatic stress disorder, but it must be temporary. If not, then it becomes a psychiatric disorder in response to a traumatic event. Intense, disturbing, intrusive thoughts and feelings related to the event can last months or even years when the event is over, precisely because the event had not been emotionally processed. Alternatively, because emotional processing and expression did not take place, sometimes there is very severe dissociation, up to the point of dissociative identity disorder. So post-trauma can resolve in ways which are permanently pathological. It can shatter the personality, and it is precisely because emotions are not expressed, not processed. The person doesn't get in touch with these emotions. There's kind of pent-up energy, which creates what Freud called abreaction. In order to cope with trauma from an event, avoidance and emotional numbing are common, but we need to encourage the PTSD patient not to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversation about the traumatic event, the places, the people who bring this event to mind as triggers or who had participated in the event. Individuals diagnosed with anxiety disorders experience emotional numbness as a response to extremely high stress levels, fear reactions, or excessive worry. In fact, avoidance of both positive and negative emotions is associated with higher levels of anxiety. So this is a counterproductive mechanism. People with anxiety become dysregulated, they numb their emotions, they lower them or delete them, they don't express them. This creates higher anxiety. Mendez points out that depressive episodes may present with decreased attunement to feelings, dulling of emotions, and emotional numbing. She says, higher levels of depression and mood dysregulation result in a greater propensity for emotional numbing. And of course, emotional numbing is a part of a larger picture, which is emotional detachment or emotional blunting, the inability to connect to others on an emotional level, and a positive means of coping with anxiety. And so emotion-focused coping is used by avoiding certain situations that might trigger anxiety. The evasion of emotional connection is one of them. So by avoiding or evading emotional connections, you don't take a risk of being hurt again. It's a form of pain or hurt aversion. It may be a temporary reaction to a stressful situation or a chronic condition such as depersonalization, derealization disorder. In other words, it's closely allied with dissociation. Emotional blunting is reduced affect display and of course is one of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And so emotional blunting, emotional detachment, they can manifest in numerous ways. Patients diagnosed with emotional detachment have reduced ability to express emotion, to empathize with others, to form powerful emotional connections. They have anxiety, they have stress disorders. This can create difficulties in maintaining personal relationships, interpersonal relationships. People move elsewhere in their minds. They appear preoccupied, not entirely there. So it mimics ADHD. but it's not. It's very often misdiagnosed as the ADHD. People may be fully present but exhibit purely intellectual behavior when emotional behavior should have been appropriate, more appropriate. So there are many ways. Emotional detachment manifests in multifarious ways. They may have a hard time to love a family member. They may avoid activities, places, and people associated with past traumas. The dissociation can lead to a lack of attention, to memory problems, and in extreme cases, amnesia. In some cases, they present an extreme difficulty in giving or receiving empathy, which can be related to the spectrum of narcissistic personality disorder. In children, the traits of aggression and antisocial behaviors are correlated to emotional detachment. These are actually early signs of emotional detachment. I would add to this precocious sexuality. It suggests that we need to evaluate children for these traits and behaviors for higher behavioral problems in order to avoid bigger problems, such as emotional detachment, in the future. We don't know for sure what is the brain background in brain abnormalities, but we know that there are behavioral mechanisms that involved in emotional detachment and in experiential avoidance, which is another manifestation. These people, for example, react very calmly to highly emotional circumstances. It's a decision to avoid engaging emotional connections. It's not an inability to emote or inability to express emotions, but it's a decision, it's a choice. There's no difficulty in doing it, it's just they prefer not to, for professional, personal, social reasons, or because of past trauma. So sometimes flat affect or shallow affect is a form of boundary in order to preserve desperately psychic integrity, to avoid undesired impact and pain and hurt by other people, to escape emotional demands, because all these had been associated in the past with pain and with trauma. So detachment does not necessarily mean avoiding empathy. It allows the person to rationally choose whether or not to be overwhelmed or manipulated by such feelings. So emotional detachment is also related to experiential avoidance. Experiential avoidance is the attempt to avoid thoughts, feelings, memories, physical sensations, and other internal experiences, even when doing so creates harm in the long run. Even when this avoidance is damaging and the person knows it's damaging, the person prefers to avoid. The process of experiential avoidance is maintained through negative reinforcement. There's a short-term relief of mounting anxiety and discomfort, and this is achieved by avoiding emotions, avoiding experiences. And this increases the likelihood that the behavior will persist. It is self-reinforcing. The current conceptualization of experiential avoidance suggests that it is not negative thoughts, emotions, and sensations that are problematic, but how one responds to them that can cause difficulties. In particular, habitual and persistent unwillingness to experience uncomfortable thoughts, uncomfortable feelings, and associated avoidance and inhibition of these experiences. This is linked to a whole range of problem. And so experiential avoidance is an integral part of third wave cognitive behavioral theories such as acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. But the general concept much precedes ACT and third wave or third generation cognitive behavioral psychology. We find, for example, the concept of defense mechanisms in psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theories. Defense mechanisms are intended to avoid unpleasant affect, discomfort, ego dystony, conflicting thoughts or conflicting motivation, dissonances. So, in a way, defense mechanisms are processes that contribute to the expression of various types of psychopathology. So they are forms of avoidance. They are forms of reframing that inhibit affect expression, affect display. And then we have process experiential therapy, which is essentially Gestalt. The base is Gestalt. So Gestalt also deals, and humanistic theory also deals with the issues of emotional inhibition and so on. In humanistic theory, for example, Carl Rogers wrote, whether the stimulus was the impact of a configuration of form, color, or sound in the environment, or the sensory nerves, or a memory trace from the past, or a visceral sensation of fear, or pleasure, or disgust, the person would be living it, would have it completely available to awareness. It's an early description of flashback. He is more open to his feelings of fear and discouragement and pain. He is more able to fully to live the experiences of his organism rather than shutting them out of awareness. So, emotional detachment, experiential avoidance, emotional blunting, flat affect, they are all defenses. They are all defenses against flashbacks, actually, or emotional dysregulation. In behavioral therapy, we also know that fears and anxieties are regulated in ways which sometimes involve counteracting avoidance. Individuals repeatedly encountering and remaining in contact with what causes them distress and comfort begin to avoid the resulting emotions. Same in cognitive theory. Reappraisals of negative thought patterns and schema perpetuating distorted beliefs lead to psychopathology involving flat affect. So there are problems associated with flat affect and denial of display and so on. Distress. Avoidance creates distress. Avoidance reinforces the notion that discomfort, distress, and anxiety are bad or dangerous, should be avoided at all costs. Sustaining avoidance requires effort and energy, so it's very depleting. Avoidance limits one's focus at the expense of truly experiencing what's going on in the present, and it may get in the way of other important aspects of life. And so I will end by summarizing the various examples. In major depressive episode, we have isolation, we have suicide. And isolation and suicide are intended to counter feelings of sadness, guilt, and low self-worth. In post-traumatic stress disorder, we have avoiding trauma reminders and triggers. We have hypervigilance, and they are intended to fend off, to defend against memories, anxiety, and concerns of safety. In social phobia, we have the avoidance of social situations, which is intended to defend against anxiety, concerns of judgment from others. In panic disorder, we avoid situations that induce panic, of course, intended to defend against fear and physiological sensations associated with anxiety and panic disorders. In agoraphobia, restricting travel outside of home or other safe areas, a constricted life, defends against anxiety, fear of having symptoms of panic. In obsessive compulsive disorder, there's a lot of checking, many rituals, repetitive rituals. They are intended to protect against worry of consequences, contamination. In substance use disorders, abusing alcohol and drugs leads to numbing, brownouts, blackouts, coma sometimes. These are intended to compensate for emotions, memories, and withdrawal symptoms, which are highly ego-dystonic. In eating disorders, we restrict food intake, purging. These are forms of avoidance. And they're intended to cater to the worry about becoming overweight, fear of losing control, actually, by proxy. And finally, in borderline personality disorder, we have self-harm, cutting, which is a form of protection against high emotional arousal, or on the contrary, a form of reminding oneself that one is alive. You see the enormous range of functionality of inappropriate, numb, flat, and shallow affect. And so it's not limited to schizophrenia by any means, and it's helping us to reconceptualize a whole host of hitherto disparate mental health conditions as actually post-traumatic conditions. This includes, of course, personality disorders. Thank you for listening.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Sam, for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
So if anyone having any question, they can ask to Dr. Sam. Anyone want to ask any questions? Okay, then we will proceed to another topic.
My name is Sam Baknin. I'm a professor of psychology and the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and many, many other books that I have written and never read. Now, let's start with a basic fact. The more empathy you have, the more enhanced or increased your empathy is. The older you are, and therefore the more developed your empathy, the less you are able to recognize emotions in other people. But wait a minute, Vaknin, you say, all of you at once. You are wrong, of course. What you wanted to say, had you not been drinking so much, is the higher the empathy, the more you are able to read other people's emotions. Empathy is the condition for reading and understanding other people properly. So if you have a high level of empathy, you understand other people's emotions better. And if you have a low level of empathy, for example, if you are a narcissist, you are not able to recognize, decipher, decode, and understand emotions in other people properly. Right? Wrong. Allow me to repeat. Studies show that increased empathy and age-related increase in empathy decrease as in down, your ability to recognize emotions in other people. Yes, I know that all the self-styled, self-proclaimed experts online are telling you otherwise. But they are telling you otherwise for one simple reason. They are not experts. That is especially true for those whose names are bracketed with academic degrees, real or fake. The literature in the past 10 years at least is pretty unanimous on this. The higher your empathy, the less you are able to decipher, decode, understand, and even recognize emotions in other people properly. I refer you to studies, the most recent ones by Israel Shvili. Israel Shvili is a single word, it's a family name. Israel, like Israel, Shvili. By Agneta Fisher and by Nanis, Nannis. That would suffice. One of these studies, for example, involves 830 people. So these are big studies. And they show an inverse proportion, an inverse relationship between empathy and the ability to recognize emotions. And this fact is critical to the topic of today's video. So today I'm going to discuss how borderlines and narcissists experience their emotions. And before we go there, let me dispense with another idiotic myth online. Everyone has emotions. Psychopaths have emotions, narcissists have emotions, borderlines have emotions, histrionics have emotions. Everyone has emotions. Even Donald Trump has emotions. Everyone. The thing is that narcissists and borderlines and histrionics and psychopaths relate to their emotions, interact with their emotions differently to what healthy, normal people do, in a different manner, in a different way. And another differentiating factor is that people with cluster B personality disorders mislabel their emotions. They mistake their emotions. They feel one thing, but they call it another. They slap the wrong labels, the wrong etiquettes on their emotions. And this is today's topic. A little primer on emotions. Emotions start with cognitions. Every single emotion you can conceive of starts with a thought. There's a thought about yourself, a thought about people around you, a thought about your environment, a thought about the circumstances, a thought about the past, a thought about the future. A thought. No emotion just erupts as is. It's preceded by a thought. Now, it is true that some of these cognitions are unconscious. It's a bit of a contradiction in terms, unconscious cognitions, but there are some cognitive processes which are unconscious, and they lead to the emergence of emotions which appear to have materialized out of nowhere. But that's a mistake. Every emotion is preceded by cognition. And then cognition alone, thinking alone, is not enough. Because what people do, they take these thoughts, then they monitor their own bodies. They pay attention to the body. So there's a thought, and then there's information gleaned from the body, coming from the body, emanating and exuded by the body. So for example, you have a thought, and then you pay attention to your heart rate. Your heart is beating faster, or you are perspiring, you're sweating, or you feel an enormous pressure, or headache, somatization symptoms. Your body is talking to you. Your body is communicating with you through a variety of autonomous and non-autonomous functions. And this, coupled with the thought, if it is conscious, leads to the next stage. And the next stage, you try to understand why is your body reacting the way it does. You invest additional thought. This time, it's analytical thought. You're analyzing your body's messages. You're analyzing your body's language. And so you do this by paying attention to the environment, by asking yourself, where am I? Who am I with? The people I'm with, are they friends or foes? Have I done something? Have they done something? So there's data coming from the environment, contextual intake. And these are the three elements that comprise the emotion and bring it on. Cognition, thoughts, information gleaned from the body, and then data from the environment. This is the raw material. Once this raw material is available, you embark on hermeneutics. You embark on interpreting the raw material. You ask yourself, here's the raw material. Here's what I've been thinking. Here's what my body is telling me. And here's the information from the environment. And here's how I feel, but I don't have a name for it. I don't have a name for it yet. What should I call it? Am I angry or am I afraid? Am I sad or am I tired? I mean, am I jealous? Am I envious? Or am I contemptuous? So you need to label. The last stage in the emergence of emotion into consciousness and the translation of emotion to behavior and to affect, this last stage involves a very important dictionary function. You're using a vocabulary of previously experienced emotions to explicate to yourself, to label these emotions, to tell you what they are. Now, what do you do when your cognition is problematic? Narcissists, borderlines, psychopaths, histrionics, and a variety of people with other personality disorders and other mental health disorders. They all have cognitive deficits, cognitive biases, and cognitive fallacies. And these cognitive deficits are very, very crucial, very important. They are ubiquitous, they're all pervasive. They affect every dimension and every aspect and every cell and every atom of the narcissist existence or the borderline's existence. They distort reality. Take, for example, the narcissist's grandiosity. The narcissist's grandiosity is a cognitive deficit. It makes him misjudge himself. He has an inflated view of himself, a fantastic view, a view that has nothing to do with reality, is divorced from reality. Equally, he has a devaluing, contemptuous, disdainful attitude to others. So he misjudges them. For example, he misjudges the damage they can do to him. So it's dangerous. Cognitive deficits are dangerous. and they are all pervasive in the sense that the narcissist can't say, okay, I will ignore that aspect of me. I will ignore this dimension of my brain processes, of my cerebral processes. I'll try to focus on something else. There's not something else. Everything is affected by the narcissist deficit. The same with the borderline. They all have cognitive deficits. So if emotion is critically dependent on cognition, if it actually starts with cognition, if there is no emotion without cognition, if it is a sine qua non, a condition that is both sufficient and necessary. So if emotion is so crucially dependent and so derivative on cognition, then if your cognitive processes are malformed, if they are defective, if they are deformed, if they are problematic, your emotions will be as well. You can't have a proper healthy emotion based on a cognitive deficit. You can't really experience emotions the way healthy people do if your thinking processes have nothing to do with reality or are utterly illogical and distorted. Cognitive deficits, cognitive problems, cognitive issues in narcissism, borderline, and other personality disorders have massive effects not only on the narcissist and the borderline's ability to emote, but on the content of their emotions, on the structure of their emotions, on what their emotions are, on the quiddity, on the essence of their emotions. Fundamental deficits and biases create emotions which are so deformed, so misaligned, so misassembled that it's very easy to misidentify them. If your emotions are bizarre, outlandish, it's very easy to get your emotions wrong, to misjudge them. One could say that the narcissist and borderline not only have an external impaired reality testing, in other words, they don't only misjudge the external environment, other people, reality itself, but they have an impaired internal reality testing. They misjudge not only the outside landscape, but their own inner landscape. And we know that cognition, we know that emotions are crucially dependent on cognition, to the extent that many scholars suggest that we should not make this distinction, that emotions are just a subtype, a class of cognitions, that emotions are actually thoughts which provoke certain bodily and mental processes, but that's all, they are thoughts. Many scholars advocate eliminating this ostensibly artificial difference that we are making today between emotions and cognitions. But at any rate, no one would argue that they are very closely aligned, that they are twins. And we know that this is true because we have conducted multiple and numerous experiments. There was an experiment where students were shown photos of women, male students were shown photos of women, and at the same time were given a mild drug which created tachycardia, created faster heartbeat. The students trying to interpret why their hearts are beating faster, they came up with the explanation that they were infatuated with the women, with the photos. So when your body signals to you, when there are changes in your body, you scramble, you try to understand, you try to imbue your existence with meaning. You're asking yourself, why is my heart beating faster? Why am I sweating? Why is my heart beating faster and sweating when I'm watching this photo of a woman? Probably I'm infatuated with her. And this is one of numerous experiments. And so we know that cognitions affect emotions. We also have techniques, therapeutic techniques, which prove this beyond any doubt. There's a technique called reappraisal. Reappraisal is when we teach people to change the cognition that underlies a certain emotion. So the client comes and says, I'm feeling sad. Then we unearth the cognition behind this feeling of sadness. And then we teach the client to change the cognition. And lo and behold, the minute the client changes the cognition, the emotion vanishes and is replaced by another emotion, which could be diametrically opposed, from sadness to extreme elation and happiness. So reappraisal is a very powerful technique for reframing cognitions so as to yield emotions on demand, in a way. Another class of therapies, they're known as desensitization or exposure therapies. And one of them is called approaching the avoided emotion. For example, approaching avoided fear. So we teach people to think their way to their emotions, to think their way through to their emotions. If there are emotions that they're avoiding, like sadness or fear, we teach them to think. And as they think the way we teach them to, suddenly the emotions are not threatening anymore, because via the cognition, they totally control the emotion, intensity of the emotion. They modulate, they fine-tune the emotion. There is no doubt in clinical settings that emotions and cognitions are two facets of the same coin. And so, if this is true, and if borderlines and narcissists and psychopaths and histrionics and others have cognitive deficits, it stands to reason that they will have emotional deficits as well. Take, for example, borderlines. Borderlines suffer from emotional dysregulation. Their emotions are so strong that they overwhelm them. The borderline feels that she is drowning in her emotions. The borderline feels that he is about to be consumed by his emotions, that his emotions are going to drive him, I don't know, to suicide. 11% of people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder commit suicide. The borderline's emotions are clear and present dangers. And the borderline, as opposed to the narcissist, had failed to develop coping mechanisms. The narcissist develops narcissism, the false self. It's a firewall, it's a decoy, and it's godlike, helps him to regulate his emotions. Indeed, many scholars suggest that borderline is simply failed narcissism, that the person with borderline personality disorder had tried as a child to develop narcissism, pathological narcissism, and had failed. And so borderlines suffer from emotional dysregulation because they don't have active narcissistic defenses. They don't have a skin, in a way. And so they get in direct touch with reality. Reality permeates them, triggers them. This is not empathy, by the way. Don't confuse this with empathy. Reality triggers them and permeates them to the extent that they regard emotions as mortal enemies. And so both borderlines and narcissists exhibit inappropriate affect. Inappropriate affect is when they react in ways which don't sit well, do not conform, are inappropriate for a certain setting. I don't know, laughing in a funeral is an example of inappropriate affect. But the etiology, the reason for the inappropriate affect is different in a borderline and in a narcissist, let alone a psychopath. The borderline reacts with inappropriate affect because she is desperately trying to get a hold, to get a handle, to reassert control over the tsunami, the emotional tsunami that is inside her, that is threatening to drown her from the inside. The narcissist reacts with inappropriate affect because he misunderstands his own emotions. The psychopath reacts with inappropriate affect in order to manipulate and terrify his environment. It's an intimidation tactic. But all three, and the histrionic, all of them get emotions misconstrued. They misjudge emotions. They misunderstand what's happening inside them. All of them experience inner stirrings. All of them experience volcanic eruptions and movements and and motions. It's like the furniture is being moved around by some whirlwind or tornado or hurricane. All of them have this inner turmoil, have this chaos. Their personality has a low organization. It's chaotic. All of them have this. But when they try to understand what's happening inside them, when they compare themselves to other people who are healthy and normal, they get it wrong. They get it wrong. And this leads me back to empathy. Narcissists, borderlines, psychopaths, histrionics, they have empathy deficits. The narcissist and the primary psychopath, they have cold empathy. Cold empathy is merely the reflexive component of empathy and the cognitive component of empathy, the analytical component. The narcissist and the primary psychopath look at other people and they read them well. They scan people. They especially home in and focus and zero in vulnerabilities, chinks in the armor, weak points, hot buttons. And so they have cold empathy, but their empathy has no emotional correlate. They don't experience emotions in response to their use of cold empathy. So if they look at a crying person, they would notice that the person is sad. They would label the person's emotions correctly. They would identify the emotion very appropriately. And the psychopath would ask himself, how can I leverage this? How can I make good use of this momentary vulnerability? Maybe I could end up having sex with that person or taking money from her or him. But this cold empathy, this ability to say, this person is crying, therefore this person is sad, does not evoke or provoke or conjure up any emotional reaction in the narcissist and psychopaths. So it's very difficult for them to create permanent correlations between information from the environment and inner emotional responses. If you look at the environment only analytically and nothing happens inside you, you will never understand what it means to be sad, truly understand what it means to love, because all you do is you're an observer. You watch, you classify, you create an enormous database, emotional resonance database, correlating certain behaviors with certain proclaimed emotions. For example, if crying, then sad, if smiling, then happy. But the words sad and happy would mean nothing to you. Similarly, the borderline, codependent, and the histrionic, they have functional empathy. They have full-fledged empathy. Their empathy includes the emotional component, but it is very, very goal-oriented. Borderlines want to ascertain that they will never be abandoned. They have abandonment and separation anxiety. Codependent is clinging and wants her intimate partner to perform important psychological functions and to cater to her needs. And the histrionic is interested in hyper-emotionality and manipulates via seduction and flirtation and appearance. So this is functional empathy. It's functional empathy because it's not other-oriented. It's not about the other. It's about you. You as a borderline. You ask yourself, I'm empathizing with this person because it gives me the tools to make sure that this person will remain in my life. If you're codependent, you're saying, I'm empathizing with this person fully, also emotionally, because this guarantees that this person will continue to love me and be in my life and perform important psychological functions for me, cater to my needs. And if you're histrionic, you're saying, I'm empathizing with this person because this way I can understand him and make him fall in love with me. It's functional empathy. Cold empathy with narcissists and psychopaths, functional empathy with borderlines, codependents, histrionics. These are empathy deficits. These are deformed, mutant. These are mutations of empathy, not healthy empathy. Full-fledged emotional empathy is turned off in all these types. Full-fledged other-oriented empathy is turned off in all these types. And why is that? Because all of them experience overwhelming negative emotionality. If they were to allow themselves to truly empathize with another person, they would risk their own lives. The trade-off in these characters, with the exception of the psychopath, exception of the primary psychopath, the trade-off in all these characters is between empathizing and emoting and survival. If they were to empathize and emote, they would be exposed to such overwhelming negative emotions that they may well die. So they prefer not to emote at all. They prefer not to empathize at all. And instead, they use primitive defense mechanisms, such as splitting, when they can no longer tolerate the risk of emotionality and the risk of overwhelming empathy. They split. They cast the other person. They convert, they transform the other person into an all-bad object. They devalue the other person. And there's object inconstancy, out of sight, out of mind. So these are all mechanisms that these seriously disturbed people are using to avoid emotions and empathy. The primary psychopath has cold empathy. The secondary psychopath has functional empathy. That's why we think that borderline personality disorder is actually a form of secondary psychopathy. And so this is the background. You're beginning to see that if you're a narcissist, you have cognitive deficits, your cognition is not working properly, you have deformed, dysfunctional empathy, cold empathy. You don't have the basic tools. You don't have the basic tools to experience emotions and to label them, to recognize them, to say, ah, that's love. Oh, that's sadness. You don't have these ultra basic tools. Same for the borderline, same with the histrionic, same with the psychopath, to some extent the codependent. The basic tools that healthy people use to recognize emotions in others and by implication in themselves, and to label what's happening inside them in accordance with empathizing, while empathizing. These are missing. People with cluster B personality disorders, in other words, are missing the basic human experience. Now, I started the presentation with a fact. And the fact is, the more empathy you have, the older you are, and therefore the more empathy you have, the more increased your empathy, because there are gradations of empathy. Some people, very tiny minority, are highly sensitive people, HSPs, and they have super developed empathy. But even so, empathy is not equally distributed. Some people are more empathic than others. But the more empathy you have, and the older you are, your ability to recognize emotions in other people decreases. Listen to this well. It's a critical insight, which we have come across in the last 10 years in psychology. Those of us who bother to read the scholarly literature. Most self-styled experts online clearly never bothered to read scholarly literature. So the more empathy you have, the less you're able to recognize emotions in other people. But if this is true, doesn't it contradict what I've just said? Didn't I just spend 20 minutes telling you that the reason narcissists, psychopaths, and borderlines cannot label their emotions properly is because they don't have working empathy? No, that's not what I've been telling you. So let's go over the same terrain again, armed with this new insight. What I've been telling you is not that narcissists and psychopaths and borderlines have less empathy than other people. What I've been telling you is that they have deformed, malformed, sick, mutated forms of empathy. It's an entirely different argument. If you take 10 healthy people, 5 of them have high empathy, 5 of them have low empathy, but it's healthy empathy, proper empathy, properly formed empathy. The ones with less empathy would recognize emotions in other people better. The ones with more empathy would recognize emotions in other people, but will do a very bad job of it. The more empathy they have, the less they are able to read people properly. The less they understand other people's emotional landscape, reactions, and sensations and feelings. That's a fact. Among healthy people, the less empathy you have, the better you are able to understand other people's emotions. But narcissists, borderlines, psychopaths, histrionics, and to some extent codependent people don't have less empathy or more empathy. They are not in this group at all. They're not healthy. Their empathy is not healthy. Their emotional regulation is not healthy. Their cognitions are problematic, unreal, fantastic, sick. So they don't have the basic tools not only to understand and label and judge properly emotions in other people, they don't have the basic tools to understand what on earth is going on inside themselves. What they do instead is what I call cognitive emoting. Healthy people, when they experience emotions, they experience it, so to speak, wholeheartedly. Their entire body is participating. By the way, literally, the entire body is participating in the experience of emotions. There are changes in the intestines. There are changes in the gut flora. There are changes in numerous other body systems. Not only in the brain. Emotion, any emotion, is a participatory sport. The entire body is involved, including the brain, of course. And the emotion is experienced in its totality, and it includes a very pronounced cognitive component and a very pronounced, so to speak, component of feeling. And it includes the assimilation, incorporation, and interpretation of sensory input. It's a systemic enterprise. When borderlines, these are healthy people, borderlines, narcissists, and psychopaths do emoting, when they experience emotions, these are not emotions. These are truncated versions of emotions because they stop at the cognitive level. In other words, where in a healthy person, there is a process, a path. Indeed, the current thinking about emotions is what we call a process thinking. So there is a path: cognition, body, information from the body, information from the environment, emotion. It's the path. With narcissists, borderlines, and so on, psychopaths, there's cognition, end of story. That's it. That's where it stops. These people, the personality disordered people, people with cluster B, they don't emote. They think their emotions. They analyze. When they try to understand what's happening to them, they analyze. They compare themselves to others. If they are very good with words, they verbalize. So someone with a borderline might tell you, now that I think of it, yeah, what I'm feeling is love. Or she may tell you, I feel something, but I don't really know if it's love. Because, for example, when you're not near me, the intensity is much lower, or it disappears. Only when you're next to me, I feel it. Or she may say, or he may say, someone with borderline, or when I feel, when I have an emotion, it's so huge, it's so intense, it's so all-devouring, it's so all-consuming that I don't have the time or the capacity, mental capacity to stop and have a look at it and analyze it. I'm swept by the wave, you know. So these people, borderlines, narcissists, and especially psychopaths and histrionics and to some extent codependents, they think about their emotions. They need to stop, they need to sit down, and they need to think. I'm feeling something. What is it that I'm feeling? Let me see. I think it's love, coming to think of it. Coming to think of it. Or I think it's anger. Because last time it was anger. Yeah, I'm quite sure that last time it was anger. Or I'm overwhelmed, I'm drowning. What is it? Fear. Probably I'm afraid of something. I'm scared of something. What am I afraid of? What is there to be afraid of? Let me look, let me see. Now, the same processes happen with healthy people, but then they segue, they seamlessly transform into emoting, into emotional reactivity. We all look for clues in the environment as to why we feel the way we do. And we all listen to our bodies, consciously or unconsciously. But then healthy people move on and they emote, they feel. Narcissists, psychopaths, and borderlines don't move on. They're in a permanent state of a puzzle, putting the jigsaw puzzles together. They are stuck at the initial phase of analyzing cognitions, thinking about it, listening to their bodies, collecting or gathering cues and information from the environment. And this for them is perpetuum mobile. It's a perpetual enterprise, never-ending enterprise, leads nowhere, results in nothing identifiable as emotion or affect. They are like, you know, do you remember the old records when you put the needle and the needle got stuck? They are that stuck needle. The record goes on and on and on. You keep listening to the same music. You're never going to get to the end of the song. You're never going to get to the point of the song. You're never going to listen to 90% of the lyrics because the needle is stuck. And cluster B patients cope with these horrible deficits in emotional cognizance in several dysfunctional ways. Dysfunctional because they are personality disordered. The personalities have very low levels of organization. They don't have the tools. They don't have the instruments. They don't have the capacity. They don't have the presence of mind to reason, to foresee consequences, to control their impulses. They don't have all this critical machinery. They are very infantile. They're very two-state. They're very primitive. They're very binary. And so they cope with these deficits by either repressing or avoiding the emotions. So the narcissist, the primary psychopath, they would simply not experience emotions. Sometimes they would experience something, and it would bother them that they don't know what it is, because they are control freaks, of course. Narcissists and primary psychopaths it's all about control. They want to control the environment, they want to control other people, because they perceive the world as hostile. It's either control or be dead. So they need to control. The world is out to get them. Everyone is an enemy. There's persecutory and paranoid ideation. And so they need to control. And if they feel something and they don't know what it is, they feel out of control. So they need to label this something. So very often you would hear the narcissist tell you, I love you. What he's doing, he's mislabeling his dependence on you for narcissistic supply. Or you would hear the psychopath saying, I'm very happy. Actually, it's probably not happiness, but it's goal attainment. He finally got there. He achieved his goal. Primary psychopaths and narcissists actually don't experience emotions. They accept negative emotions. They experience anger or rage. They experience envy. Envy is a criterion, diagnostic criterion in the DSM-4 for narcissistic personality disorder. So some emotions get through, and these are the emotions that allow them to lord over other people, to control other people, to subjugate other people, and to convert them into slaves or sources of supply, or to cajole other people, charm other people. These emotions get through, but even then, these are not real emotions. For example, the narcissist is never angry. He rages. The psychopath is never really emotionally invested in any project or any endeavor or any activity. Anyone who had sex with a psychopath can tell you this. Psychopath is not really into the sex. So they're not there. These are people who are defined not by their existence, but by their absence. These are disorders of absence, not of existence. So they don't experience emotions. And when negative emotions break through the protective veil, break through the false self, in the case of the narcissist, or break through the feigned indifference and defiance of the psychopath, when these emotions break through, they're malignant, they're cancerous, they're unrecognizable to a healthy person. How can you compare anger to narcissistic rage? It's like the emotion has metastasized somehow. The second mechanism that people with cluster B use when they are faced with their inability to grasp what's happening inside them, to label it, to judge it properly, to recognize it, to tell the world what's going on, when they realize these deficits. So the first thing they do, they repress or avoid, if they are narcissist or primary psychopath. Second thing they do, they misjudge the intensity or the semiotics of the emotion. In other words, they misjudge the signaling of the emotion, the cue that the emotion gives them, the information contained in the emotion. So a histrionic, for example, is likely to misjudge the nature of the relationship, how deep it is, how long-lasting, how involved the parties are. This is so true that misjudging the intensity of romantic emotions is one of the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-4 for histrionic personality disorder. They are totally clueless. Totally clueless. They misread everything: social cues, sexual cues, virtue signaling, proper signaling, information of all kinds, environmental, sexual, interpersonal. This is their way of avoiding the painful realization that they are divorced from themselves, that they have no access to themselves, that their emotions are artifacts way beyond their reach. And so instead of admitting to this, what they do, they construct their own dictionary, their own vocabulary, their own private language, which no one else frankly understands. And they impose it. They impose it on other people. They impose it on the environment. After one day, if you date a histrionic, after one day, you are the love of her life. And on the second day, she wants to marry you. It's her way of asking herself, what am I feeling? What are my emotions with this guy? Oh, probably I'm in love with him. Probably I'm in love with him. Looks like it. Stands to reason. Stands to reason that I'm in love. Makes sense that I'm in love with him. Well, if I'm in love with him, why wait? Let's get married. This is radicalization and escalation, which I could call it even semantic escalation. Escalation of meanings. And the third mechanism is dissociation. Dissociating the emotions. If you can't join them, beat them. If you can't understand your emotions, if you can't label them, if you can't judge them, if you can't recognize them, if you cannot communicate them to others, why have them at all? Dissociate them, cut them off, scissor them away like so many coupons in an ancient newspaper. Just pretend they're not there. Pretend they're not there. And this happens with borderline personality disorder and the secondary psychopath. Now, borderline, which today we think is female secondary psychopathy. Borderline, essentially what she does, she leverages, she uses several very important defense mechanisms which survive from childhood, infantile defense mechanisms, in order to dissociate her emotions. Dissociation is a diagnostic criterion of borderline personality disorder because a borderline dissociates on multiple levels and in every conceivable way. She depersonalizes. A borderline would tell you, I felt that I was on autopilot. I felt it wasn't me. I felt I was observing myself from the outside. She derealizes. She can say, I felt I was in a movie. I felt the whole thing was unreal. Or she has dissociative amnesia. She will insist that she can't remember what had happened, what she had done. She will attribute it to drink. I drank too much, so I had a blackout. I mean, she would dissociate. And while dissociating the emotions, she makes use of her object inconstancy. It's very difficult to forget your emotions if you have no object inconstancy. Out of sight, out of mind. You are married, you have a spouse, you go out, he no longer exists because out of sight, out of mind. And so then it's easy to do all kinds of things, to misbehave, because he no longer is. And because he no longer is, there are no emotions attendant on him, and no emotions attendant on the misconduct. In other words, there's no emotional reactivity when you can forget the trigger. If you cheat on your husband as a borderline woman, and it's much easier to do if your husband is out of sight, out of mind, and you have no emotions connected to the act. So dissociating emotions is a major defense against mislabeling, against this alienation, this estrangement between the cluster B personality disordered patient and his own emotional processes. Coping strategies in all these, literally all these personality disorders, coping strategies involve self-soothing. And self-soothing is dysfunctional. Vast majority of self-soothing techniques or strategies are actually dysfunctional. They're self-defeating, they're self-destructive, they're self-trashing, they're reckless. Overeating is self-soothing. Getting drunk is self-soothing. Promiscuous sex is self-soothing. Pathological gambling is self-soothing. All kinds of bodily behaviors which are harmful, most of them are connected to self-soothing. You can self-soothe with men. You can self-soothe with sex. You can self-soothe with drink. Anything and everything can be self-soothing, and most self-soothing has an addictive, or at the very least, conditioned element. You do it almost automatically, almost reflexively, when you are under stress or traumatized or in pain. And reckless behaviors are also self-soothing. And all the personality disordered, narcissists, borderline, psychopaths, when they're faced with their emotional invalidity, with the fact that they're emotional cripples, with their disability, and it's not only a disability to emote, it's not only a disability to experience the emotion, it's even a disability to tell yourself and others what it is that you're feeling. When they're faced with this enormous limitation, with this loss, horrendous loss of 80% of what's beautiful in existence, in human existence, they're not stupid. Many narcissists and psychopaths are actually super intelligent. Cleckly claims that most psychopaths are more intelligent than usual. So these are intelligent people, and they know what they are missing. They know intellectually, they know rationally, they don't know in the heart, but they know in the mind, in the brain, what they're missing. They know they're missing out on everything that's beautiful, everything that makes people human, everything they're missing out on the most profound experiences. There's nothing more profound than emotions. Falling in love. Is there anything that comes close to it? They know they're missing on all this. They know they've been deprived. They feel a deep sense of injustice and resentment, and which is at the heart and the engine that drives, for example, the psychopath's antisocial defined activities, acts. He's angry. Narcissist is angry. The borderline is angry at themselves to start with, but somehow at the world for having made them like this. They try to blame their parents, try to blame society. They are looking for a scapegoat. They don't know. They're thrashing about. They don't know how to. And so they try to self-soothe very dysfunctionally and destructively. And many of them, especially when they grow older, and self-soothing no longer works, or the costs of self-soothing have become such that even they understood, got it through their thick skulls that, enough with this promiscuity, enough with this drinking, enough with this drug abuse, substance abuse, etc. So then they switch from self-soothing to repetition compulsions. It's kind of hope springs eternal. They try again and again and again. And every time they fail, they withdraw, they isolate, they avoid. So there's this approach avoidance, repetition compulsions. Older narcissists, borderline, psychopaths, and histrionic, let's say above the age of 30 or 35, their approach avoidant. They try to provoke in themselves some emotions and to do it in a controlled, restricted, restrained, constrained way so that they can be sure what emotions they are provoking and evoking. Since they cannot label emotions, they cannot recognize emotions, they need to experience emotions, they need to provoke in themselves emotions in controlled environments. So if they want to experience love, they would select a partner, home in on the partner. That explains behaviors such as love bombing and grooming. These are controlled behaviors. These behaviors emanate from the need to control not only the partner. It's a common mistake online. The love bombing and grooming has somewhat to do with the partner. It has a lot to do with the narcissists and psychopaths. Because love bombing and grooming are control tactics. And above all, they need to control their internal environment so that when there is an emotional reaction, when they do experience emotions, they will know what this emotion is. Why? Because they narrowed the protocol. They limited the space. They controlled, they micromanaged the interaction. And gradually, as approach fails, is followed by avoidance, and then another approach followed by more avoidance and withdrawal, it takes more and more courage, more and more depleted energy, more and more effort to approach again. There is hurt aversion and pain aversion, even in psychopaths and narcissists and borderlines, especially borderlines, but even in narcissists and psychopaths, histrionics, not to mention borderlines and codependents. Borderlines are driven by hurt aversion or pain aversion. So it's very painful to approach and avoid, approach and withdraw, approach and lose, approach and be betrayed. It's very painful. And so gradually, narcissists and psychopaths and borderlines, they develop persecutory introjected objects. In other words, they gradually form paranoid delusions, persecutory delusions, centered around introjects. In other words, centered around internalized objects. So their initial approach to other people would be very, very cautious, wary, suspicious, and they would immediately transform these other people. Take a snapshot, internalize a snapshot as an internal object in order to control the object. Because as a snapshot, you're in total control. But then gradually, as the real person deviates and diverges from the snapshot, they will begin to feel that the meaningful other, the significant other, the intimate partner, is frustrating them intentionally and malevolently and maliciously. They would convert the intimate partner into a persecutory, introjected object. And this would be the topic of our next video. So I'll tell you what you're feeling now. You're feeling tired and bored, and you want to dislike this video, but you can't, because you don't want any bad blood between you and me. Trust me on that. Just kidding. I've been using the term emotional dysregulation preponderantly. Look it up. Emotional dysregulation. It gives the impression of some kind of paroxysm or seizure or a sudden, abrupt, terrifying loss of control. It is reminiscent of the phenomenon of switching in borderline personality disorder. I dedicate a video to this. But actually, there is little real understanding of this underlying psychodynamic, which is common in borderline personality disorder, but also makes its appearance in narcissistic personality disorder and in other unrelated mental health issues, for example, some kinds of mood disorders and so on. So today I want to delve deeper into this emotional dysregulation thingy known in Europe and the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, as emotional instability. So there's emotionally unstable personality disorder, which is the other name for borderline personality disorder. Emotional instability or instability, emotional dysregulation, that's a fun ride that is awaiting you, dear viewers. And who am I to guide you through all this? I am the emotionally regulated professor of psychology, Sam Vaknin, and also the author of the emotionally dysregulated book, Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, the first book to have ever described narcissistic abuse. Let us sink deeper and immerse ourselves in the crazy-making world of cluster B personality disorders, overwhelmed by emotions, affective dysregulation in borderlines and narcissists. The first thing we need to understand is that dysregulation, emotional dysregulation, also known as affective dysregulation, is induced by both positive affects and negative affects. Both positive emotions and negative emotions can and do induce dysregulation in people with a premorbid state, or people with a personality disorder. That's point number one. So if you are in love, or if you've just been rejected, humiliated, and abandoned publicly, in both cases, you may end up reacting with emotional dysregulation if you have borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. Number two, there are two types of emotional dysregulation, and regrettably, they're not sufficiently demarcated in the literature. There is anticipatory emotional dysregulation, and there is reactive emotional dysregulation. Let me explain the difference, and it is a vast, very crucial difference. Anticipatory emotional dysregulation is when the individual is anxious, develops anxiety, because the individual is catastrophizing. So, for example, when the borderline anticipates, fully expects abandonment and rejection and regards them as inevitable, ineluctable, nothing she can do about it, out of her control. There's an external locus of control. Her fate, her moods, her emotions are determined from the outside. This anxiety, this catastrophizing, this anticipation of the worst can and do induce emotional dysregulation. That's one type. The other type of emotional dysregulation has to do with reactance or reactivity. It is triggered by something. So it is post facto. It is after the fact. It's emotional dysregulation that, for example, happens in the wake of actual abandonment or in the aftermath of ostentatious, conspicuous public humiliation and rejection. In all these cases, there is reactive emotional dysregulation. Point number 3. Dysregulation is not the same as emotional chaos or emotional disorganization or emotional disorder. It's not the same. It's not about chaos. It's not about mayhem. It's not about a vortex, all-consuming whirlpool. This image of, as I said, a paroxysm or a seizure. That's epilepsy. That's not borderline personality disorder. So it's not about this. It's also actually, in my view, not about instability of emotions. It's not about lability. There's a confusion, including in the ICD, between lability and dysregulation. Many people have labile moods and labile affects, ups and downs, depression, euphoria, intense love, less intense love. So there are gradations, and there's a spectra, and there are continua of emotions and so on. But instability is not the same as dysregulation. Therefore, emotionally unstable personality disorder in the ICD is a bad choice of words. Again, we should not confuse lability with dysregulation. Lability is a form of cycling. Even in extreme cases, lability can involve switching. Dysregulation is something completely different. Dysregulation also doesn't have anything to do with amplification or magnification of emotions. We have this image of the emotion as a wave, a tsunami that somehow carries you and then bangs you against debris and walls and then destroys you and drowns you and I don't know what. This tsunami imagery, this tsunami metaphor is wrong. Emotional dysregulation is not about the intensity of the emotion, not about even about the abruptness or suddenness of the emotion. It's not about the traits, it's not about the characteristics of the emotion. So it's not about amplifying or magnifying the emotion. Emotional dysregulation or affective dysregulation is a form of lack of regulation. I think dysregulation gives the wrong impression. I think the correct term should have been a-regulation, no regulation, absence of regulation, unregulation. So when regulatory mechanisms cease to operate somehow, are compromised, hindered, impeded, reversed, then we have dysregulation. It's absence of regulation. It is a form of internal decompensation and disinhibition. What happens is all the defenses collapse and all the inhibitions vanish. And then we have a disinhibited state, which by definition is not regulated. And the last point I want to make before I go into the territory of definitions and what we know and clinical data and clinical information, before I go into all this, for clinicians mainly, the last point I want to make is that emotional dysregulation has a lot to do with appraisal failure. Catastrophizing is a form of appraisal failure. Appraisal is the cognitive evaluation of the nature and significance of some phenomenon or some event, including an internal process. So when you evaluate, when you appraise, when you gauge an internal process or an external process, something, that is called appraisal. In emotional dysregulation, there's a failure of appraisal. The events, and when I say event, it's a general term for everything, including internal dynamics. They are events. Internal dynamics are kinds of events, internal events. So when the individual fails to correctly appraise the event, its nature, its strength, its future, its path, its developmental path, its how threatening it is, how promising it is. When there's a failure of appraisal, often the outcome is catastrophizing, tending to unrealistically predict disasters and negative outcomes. So the catastrophizing generates anxiety, and the anxiety leads to dysregulation. So there's appraisal failure involved here. Okay, let's get acquainted with a few terms that have an intimate relationship with emotional dysregulation. And by the way, as a side note, it's very interesting to realize that intimacy is intimately connected to emotional dysregulation. Emotional dysregulation is much more common in intimate relationships, and that raises fascinating questions. Number one, why? What in intimacy generates dysregulation and disinhibition and a total collapse of defenses and so on and so forth? Why is intimacy so threatening, so destabilizing? What in intimacy leads the individual to let go of any attempt to control his or her internal environment? Well, of course, we are talking about pathological forms of intimacy. For example, merger and fusion, enmeshment. In these situations, there is an outsourcing of internal functions, including ego functions, to another person. And then the risk of losing that other person is immense. It's like losing yourself. So there is amplification and magnification, not of the emotions, but of the situation, of intimacy as an all-encompassing, all-engulfing envelope or bubble or globe within which your chances to get hurt, your chances to suffer are much heightened. In other words, intimacy is perceived as a threat that inevitably leads to pain and hurt and brokenness and damage. That's why intimacy is connected with emotional dysregulation. Okay, a few terms, a few clinical terms. Emotional charge. Emotional charge is usually a strong emotion. It could be anger, but it could also be love. It's important to understand that positivity and negativity are value judgments. Positivity and negativity are social constructs. They're imposed from the outside. As far as the mind is concerned, what matters is the existence of the emotion, the functions of the emotion, and the intensity, the amplitude of the emotion. The rest doesn't matter. So love can be as threatening, as destabilizing as hate or anger or envy. Negative affectivity and positive affectivity are equipotent in their capacity to induce dysregulation. So a strong emotion, anger, love, whatever the case may be, conceived as being bottled up under pressure and ready to explode, is known as an emotional charge. Emotions are negatively or positively charged, and when they're bottled up, this primes the ground for an eruption, a volcanic eruption or an earthquake. Emotional charge is one of the elements, one of the components of emotional dysregulation. And the second one is emotional blocking. Emotional blocking has to do with the inhibition of emotions, or actually more precisely, the inhibition of thought, speech, and other responses due to extreme emotion. So when there's an extreme emotion, sometimes we go emotionally numb. We have reduced affect display. And these, ladies and gentlemen, are actually forms of emotional dysregulation. So emotional dysregulation doesn't have to be the equivalent of a temper tantrum or a paroxysm or a seizure or some kind of insane display of acting out. No. Emotional dysregulation could result in the exact opposite, a catatonia-like freezing, numbness, lack of affect, automatic, robotic conduct, um, denuding the individual of any élan vital, of any life force, kind of decaffecting or taking away the libido, if you wish. I don't know which other metaphors to use. So this is also a form of emotional dysregulation, because all forms of emotional dysregulation involve emotional conflict. Emotional conflict is a disharmonious, dissonant state because they're incompatible intense emotions, or because the intensity itself is perceived as ego dystonic, as unacceptable to the individual, uncomfortable, unpleasant, and also socially unacceptable. So emotional conflict sets the ground for emotional dysregulation. Emotional blocking is one form of emotional dysregulation. Emotional charge is the other form of emotional dysregulation. This state of disharmony, which is the breeding grounds for emotional dysregulation, is irresolvable. The conflict is perceived as irreconcilable. There's no solution. So, for example, ambivalence is such a case. In ambivalence, we hate and love the same person. Cognitive dissonance of some types prime the ground for emotional dysregulation. Intense emotions that are perceived as threatening and all-consuming and all-devouring, such intense emotions would also generate emotional conflict. And as I said, when your emotions are perceived to be socially unacceptable, loathsome, condemnable, uncomfortable, unpleasant, dissonant, then you would also tend to dysregulate. In other words, emotional dysregulation is a form of distress. It's a distress signal, but it also reifies distress. It is distress. It's just the way distress manifests and expresses itself. One of the big problems of people with emotional dysregulation as a feature, as a clinical feature, people with borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, one of the big problems is that they lack emotional cognition. Their emotional cognition is compromised. Emotional cognition is just another name for mentalization or theory of mind. Yeah? It's the ability to recognize and interpret the emotions of other people. We gather all kinds of cues like facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, and of course, explicit speech acts, verbal acts. And then we put all these together, we create a theory about the other person, and we interpret another person's feeling, emotions correctly or incorrectly. If our emotional cognition is compromised, if it's low, then we would tend to interpret other people's emotions wrongly most of the time, which would create situations which are at minimum awkward and at maximum dangerous, and would lead to emotional dysregulation, because emotions are reactive to the environment. We'll talk about it in a minute. When we delineate the distinction between feelings, emotions, and affects, you will see that emotions are directional. We love someone. We hate someone. It always has a direction. It has an arrow. It's environmentally responsive. So when we misinterpret the emotions of other people on a consistent basis, because our emotional cognition is impaired or compromised, we are very likely to create situations where our own emotions would be misinterpreted by us. Emotional cognition goes both ways, public facing outwardly and inwardly. And so the impairment of emotional cognition is associated with a range of psychological conditions. For example, autism spectrum disorder. But I think it's high time to introduce this element into the study of emotional dysregulation. Of course, emotional cognition goes hand in hand with empathy. So, as a prediction, we could say that people with reduced empathy, compromised empathy, partial empathy are much more likely to experience emotional dysregulation, and this truly is the case. Emotional disturbance is a fear, anxiety, or other emotionally based condition that results in maladaptive behavior. So the individual experiences the emotional disturbance, and emotional dysregulation, of course, is one form, one kind, one variant of emotional disturbance. So then this kind of individual who has this unpleasant experience, unpleasant is the understatement of a century, this kind of individual is likely to develop behavioral strategies which are maladaptive, dysfunctional, withdrawal, avoidance, isolation, acting out, externalized aggression. They're all attempts to cope with one's own emotions and how these emotions threaten to overwhelm the system because there's no regulation present. And so this, of course, has implications in real life and functioning. And so there is a debate to which extent emotional dysregulation could be diagnosed in children. And I think it's a spurious debate. I don't think there's any question that children can and are very often, can be and are very often emotionally dysregulated. And there is even a diagnosis which pertains to children. It's known as serious emotional disturbance, SED. But I will not go into it right now. Maybe I'll dedicate a special video to emotional dysregulation in children. Right now we are focused on adults. And so what do you do when you constantly misinterpret the emotions of other people? This triggers in you emotions that are alien to you and that you misinterpret equally, and you're terrified by this situation because you feel that you are like a puppet and everyone is pulling your strings. Well, one solution is what is known as emotional dissemblance. Emotional dissemblance is a lack of correspondence between an individual's internal affective state and the outward expression of these emotions. So it could be intentional. Dissemblance could be intentional. The individual is lying about their emotional state. But dissemblance is often unconscious, where the individual's emotional broadcast, emotional facade, emotional emanations are actually ill correlated or lowly correlated with what's really going on inside. And this discrepancy, this gap, creates internal tension because it's dissonant. And this tension accumulates and becomes anxiety, and the anxiety finally shuts off all the regulatory mechanisms, and we have emotional dysregulation. You're beginning to see that emotional dysregulation has many sources, and that it has consequently many facets or many aspects, some of them mutually exclusive and irreconcilable. So it's a very wide spectrum phenomenon. And when I say emotional dysregulation, of course, I'm talking about emotions. So what are emotions? And in which way emotions are not the same as feelings or not the same as affects? Or what are we talking about? Let us define these words before we proceed. It is important to understand that many scholars believe that emotions are just one type of cognitions. They're kind of thought that is experienced in a different way to cognition, but they're still cognitions. Be that as it may, emotions are complex. They're not simple. There is not a single simple emotion. When you say anger, when you say love, when you say hate, when you say envy, it's a complex thing. And emotions, as I said earlier, are directional. They're outward or public facing, outward looking. They are reactive to the environment. Emotions are reaction patterns, and they involve many elements, experiential elements, behavioral elements, even physiological elements. We can induce emotions through the body. We can even induce emotions through visual input. We can induce emotions. There's famous experiments where people experience, in the experiment, people were made to experience tachycardia, like a faster heartbeat. And then they were shown pictures, photos of potential partners, and they said that they were falling in love. So the body informed the mind. So emotions emerge from the body very often. And emotions are there because we weigh things differently. Some things are more important to us, something are more significant, some things are perceived as threats or a menace, some things are perceived as crucial for survival, and so on. This system of weighing or weighting things is regulated or mediated, I would say, via emotions. Emotions attempt, an emotion is an attempt to deal with a personally significant matter, person, or event, the specific quality of the emotion. Anything from shame to love, from fear to anger, specific quality is determined by the specific significance of the object of the emotion. Be that another person, be that a decision, be that an environment, be that an institution, whatever the object of the emotion is, we love someone, we hate someone, whatever and whoever that someone is, this determines the profile of the emotion and the quality of the emotion. If the significance involves threat, fear is likely to be generated. If the significance involves disapproval, shame is likely to emerge. And if the significance is about, having found your soulmate, the reaction would probably be love. Sex appeal or attractiveness would generate infatuation and limerence. Emotion typically involves feeling, but it's not the same as feeling because it has an overt or implicit engagement with the world. And this is where dysregulation comes in. Because the world can and does dysregulate people. Reality dysregulates people. The environment dysregulates people. Emotional dysregulation is often induced from the outside, not from the inside. In other words, the perception that emotional dysregulation is a wholly contained psychodynamic process is manifestly wrong. And unfortunately, underlies most of the literature on personality disorders, especially borderline and narcissistic. It's completely wrong. The same individual with borderline personality disorder is likely to not react with emotional dysregulation or react with emotional dysregulation, depending crucially on the environment, on the intimate partner, on the type of relationship, on expectations, on previous experiences, including immediate experiences, on cues, on triggers, on stimuli, it's an endless array of possibilities, of switches. So it's wrong to characterize emotional dysregulation as emanating from the inside, confined to the inside, like some kind of caged animal in the zoo of personality disorders. I said that emotion contains feeling, but is outwardly directed at the world. It's a mode of engaging with the world. You could even conceive of emotions as forms of communication, as signaling, a type of signaling. For example, anger is intended to signal displeasure and modify people's behavior. So there is a manipulative element in emotions. When we communicate emotions, we expect other people to comply, to somehow alter, change, and modify their behaviors to reduce the intensity or even the existence of the emotion. You see that emotions are much more complex than I get up in the morning and I'm angry. They have to do with a strategy for surviving within a specific environment in an adaptive way. They are, I would say, evolutionary survival strategies, and also at the same time, signaling mechanisms and communication modes. Feelings are much more primitive. Feelings are much more basic. A feeling is a self-contained phenomenal experience. So when most scholars, and not to mention self-styled experts and laymen, discuss emotional dysregulation, they actually mean to say feeling dysregulation. Feeling is indeed self-contained. And it's an experience, and there is a phenomenology to it, but it's self-contained. Its feelings are subjective, they're evaluative, they're independent of sensations, thoughts, or images that evoke them. Independent. They are not reactive like emotions. Feelings are inevitably evaluated as pleasant or unpleasant, but they can have more specific intrapsychic qualities. So the affective tone of the feeling could be determined in a variety of ways. For example, the affective tone of fear is experienced as different to the affective tone of anger. The core characteristics that differentiate feeling from cognitive or sensory or perceptual intrapsychic experiences is the fact that affect is connected to appraisal. You remember appraisal? Discussed appraisal earlier. It's like building blocks. There's affect, there's appraisal. Put these two together, you get a feeling. Direct the feeling outwardly at the environment and you get an emotion. Feelings differ to emotions. They're purely mental, whereas emotions are designed to engage with the world, but otherwise feelings are a crucial component of emotions. What about affects? We keep saying affective dysregulation. Affects are not emotions. Affect is the experience of feeling, the experience of emotion. It's how you experience these things. Suffering, for example, is not an emotion. It's an affect. You experience suffering, and suffering is a composite of multiple emotions. You experience elation similarly. There are simple affects, complex affects, depending on the ingredients or on the composition of the affect, on what comprises the affect. Because feelings and emotions could also be simple or complex. There's normal affect, pathological affect, because emotional reactions could be normal or pathological. And of course, ultimately, there is reduced affect or even lack of affect, known as flat affect. That is a form of numbing, self-numbing, which implies the utter failure of regulation, a failure that threatens the individual from the inside and forces the individual to shut down the entire emotional mechanism. Affect can be positive or negative. Mood and emotion are affective states, but they are not affects. Along with cognition and conation, I have a video dedicated to conation, by the way, affect is one of three traditionally identified components of the mind. Now, what is positive affect? Positive affect is the internal feeling state, the affect that occurs when something good has happened to you. A goal has been attained. A source of threat has been removed or avoided. You have accomplished your dream or your wish, fulfilled your wish. You're satisfied with the present state of affairs, whatever the case may be. When you experience such states, this is called positive affectivity. In emotionally dysregulated people, people with borderline personality disorder and to some extent narcissistic personality disorder, positive affect and negative affect are indistinguishable from each other. The valence, the value of the affect, plus or minus, is not relevant. The very existence of the affect can and sometimes generates emotional instability, emotional dysregulation, shuts off the regulatory mechanism. Affect is not tolerated. It's as if these kind of individuals have an allergic reaction to affect. Whenever affect is present, there's a risk that the whole house of cards will fall apart and the individual will be overwhelmed and reduced to sobbing or reduced to inactivity, a catatonic state. Now, in narcissism, emotional dysregulation is totally context dependent. Narcissists emotionally dysregulate only in highly specific states. Collapse, narcissistic mortification, and sometimes narcissistic injuries. The It was Kernberg who suggested that narcissism is actually a defense against emotional dysregulation, a defense against borderline personality disorder or borderline personality organization. So narcissism is the opposite of emotional dysregulation. It's a solution to emotional dysregulation. It's a pathological solution, dysfunctional solution, hurtful solution, crazy solution, but it's a solution. It reduces the incidence of emotional dysregulation in the individual. However, narcissism, like any solution, is not fail-safe. It sometimes fails. And when it fails, we have emotional dysregulation. The individual narcissist actually becomes clinically indistinguishable from a borderline patient. Negative affect, positive affect. Negative affect is the internal feeling that occurs when you fail to achieve a goal, or when there is a threat present, or when you're not satisfied with your life, or whatever the case may be. Negative affectivity, positive affectivity in healthy people, very different in mentally ill people, people with personality disorders, and people with other kinds of disorders, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, depressive illnesses. In all these people, the positivity or negativity are much less relevant than the existence, the presence, and the intensity of the affect. The affective tone is the mood or the feeling that are associated with a particular experience or stimulus. So the affective tone, most healthy people, most normal people are aware of the affective tone. But mentally unhealthy or mentally disordered people, they are not self-aware in many important ways, and this is no exception. They cannot describe the affective tone, the mood or the feeling associated with any cue or information from the environment or stimulus or experience. They just can't verbalize it. Not only verbalize, they can't really experience it. That's why they find it difficult to communicate it. There is a breakdown between the apparatus or the mechanism of experiencing and the mechanism of emoting and the mechanism of mood. So it's like experiences are objective ontological events and phenomena that give no rise to an emotional correlate, to a feeling, to a mood. It's as if you would say to a healthy person, the sun is 150 million kilometers away from Earth. Okay, that's a cognition, that's a thought, that's a fact, but it doesn't provoke any emotional reaction. But if you were to tell a healthy person, your loved one has just died, that's also a fact, but it would of course provoke an outburst or a total collapse, mentally, emotionally, and so on. With a borderline and the narcissist, the two sentences are indistinguishable as far as the affective tone, as far as the internal experience of them. When you say the earth is that far from the sun, or a loved one died, the narcissist, and to a lesser extent the borderline, register it as neutral statements, as far as inner experience, as far as emoting, as far as... Now, it's not to say that these kind of sentences cannot invoke or provoke or elicit internal dynamics in the narcissist and the borderline. They do, but it is the experience of these dynamics that is either compromised or impaired or lacking. And this distinction is very important. When you tell the borderline your loved one, your intimate partner, has been cheating on you, there's infidelity here, the borderline is likely to erupt in enormous rage or to collapse completely into a heap or to fall apart or to act out or to do something crazy and self-destructive. Something's definitely going to happen there. And yet the internal experience of all this is mysteriously opaque, inaccessible even to the borderline. She goes through the motions, but she feels compelled from the outside or compelled from the inside, doesn't matter. She feels as if she is a puppet, a marionette. Someone is pulling her strings, someone internal or someone external. It doesn't much matter because she outsources her internality to the outside, so it doesn't matter. This distinction, external and internal, doesn't exist in borderline and in narcissism. So she feels as if she is a plaything, some kind of plaything, flotsam, jetsam on the waves of life. This external locus of control explains the lack of affective tone. And it leads to dysregulation, an excessive, poorly managed kind of environment where regulation ceases to operate. The mechanism, it's very important, mechanisms that keeps the equilibrium, the homeostasis, the balance, the internal balance, and that creates a semblance of continuity and stability. It's a semblance, but in healthy people, it's a very convincing semblance. It even convinces them. So this mechanism breaks down. And then we have extreme or inappropriate emotional responses to situations, temper outbursts, deliberate self-harm, I mean, you name it. And of course, all this has to do with a lack of regulatory environment. When the regulatory environment is either extremely primitive, habitually outsourced, or prone to breakdowns, very fragile, very vulnerable, then we have the preconditions for a constant state of dysregulation. Self-regulation is when healthy people control their behaviors through the use of self-monitoring. They self-observe. There's introspection here. There's a record of one's previous experiences, life history, behaviors, and so on. It's as if a healthy individual compiles a library as he goes or she goes along life, along the trajectory of life. And this self-observation, this self-monitoring, this introspection, they're critical for regulation because they lead to the next stages of self-evaluation, assessing the information obtained during the self-observation, and self-reinforcement, rewarding oneself for appropriate behavior or attaining a goal, and on the contrary, punishing oneself for having been delinquent or lacking somehow. Self-regulatory processes are very crucial, and they form a part of many therapies, like behavior therapies. Now, the problem with people with borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, but as I said, bipolar disorder, autism spectrum disorder, psychological trauma, CPTSD, complex trauma, brain injury even. The problem with all these people is that the components of self-regulation are either out of whack, they don't feed each other appropriately or in a timely fashion, or they are disabled or impaired, compromised dramatically, corrupted somehow, or they collude in trying to destroy the individual, to eliminate the individual. They have a nefarious, malevolent agenda of self-negation, whereas in a healthy person, self-monitoring, self-evaluation, and self-reinforcement would work together in order to enhance, to increase self-efficacy and guarantee positive outcomes from the environment. In a mentally ill person, these very modules will collude, as I said, will conspire to destroy the individual, to reduce self-efficacy, to induce anxiety and dread, to disable and paralyze the individual. So there is an internal fifth column. There's a Trojan horse in these people that attempts to destroy them because they've been brought up to believe that they are unworthy and inadequate and losers and ugly and stupid. The internalized bad object, the primitive superego, or the moral defense. Choose your school in psychology. And so we have this self-regulatory resources theory. It's a model in psychology, and it states that self-regulation depends on global but finite. So there's a global but finite pool of resources. These resources are scarce. They're accessible to all the psychological dynamics. They're accessible to all the psychological constructs and processes. I call them the databases. Yeah, they're accessible, but after all, they're finite. They're scarce, and so they can be depleted by situational demands. And there is something called ego depletion. It's a state marked by a reduction in the capacity for volition, initiative, choice, self-regulation, and so on. So when we have a situation where the circumstances, environment, other people, especially significant people, and so on, impose too many demands and requirements and constraints and expectations on the individual, it could create ego depletion. Ego depletion is temporary. The ego is restored to rest. Positive emotions interfere and intervene to mend fences and reconstruct everything, and so on. Volition is replenished. Volition is a faculty by which the individual decides on a particular course of action, commits himself to this course of action. Freud would have called it cathexis. I mean, Freud hated the word cathexis, but it's the equivalent of cathexis. And so when there is no direct external influence, it comes from the inside, volition. It's a crucial set of activities involving the self, choice, decision, self-control, intentional action, active response rather than passive response. And volition depends on a limited resource. This resource is expended whenever the self makes a decision or exerts control or attempts to interact with the environment. So we have this picture of some kind of a pool of resources, some kind of mental energy, or what Freud called psychic energy, and so on. And then it's limited, it's scarce. And whenever you do something, whenever you act, whenever you make a choice, whenever you make a decision, whenever you interact with other people, whenever you attempt to change the environment or modify other people's behaviors, whatever you try to do, you are using up these resources. You're depleting them, and they need to be replenished. So your ego is depleted in the self-regulatory resources theory, and it needs to be replenished. Problem with mentally ill people, people with borderline narcissistic personalities or others, problem with these people is that their capacity to replenish the ego, if you wish, the self, or the resources of the self, their capacity is extremely limited. They are not self-regenerating. They are not self-refreshing. They are not self-reconstructing. And the reason is very simple. They don't possess a self. The self in borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and arguably in other mental illnesses, the self is either fragmented, so not coherent, not cohesive. It's not action-oriented somehow. It is delusional. In psychosis, in narcissism, it's delusional. So impaired reality testing reduces ability to act in the environment or on the environment. It reduces self-efficacy. Something is wrong with the self. In some extreme situations, the self has never been formed. There's been a disruption in the formation of the self. In most of these people, there's identity diffusion, identity disturbance. There's no core identity. There's nobody there. So who's going to do the refreshing and replenishing? There's no one there. No central agent, no executive authority. So these people get depleted very fast. Their resources are much more finite and scarce than the resources of healthy people. Their volition is easily dwindles and wanes and never waxes. And the whole edifice of self-management falls apart, crumbles with every challenge, with every stimulus, with every demand, with every change, with every transformation, with every new person, with every new job, with every new relationship. The whole thing falls apart. Self-management is lacking, and I'm being charitable, in people with these disorders, especially borderline and narcissism. Self-management is the ability to control behavior, especially when a specific objective is in question. Goal-oriented behavior, the pursuit of specific objectives. I don't know, weight loss, for example. Self-management is a desirable aspect of the individual, both personally and socially. But some forms of self-management may be detrimental to mental and physical health. So when self-management goes awry, out of control, when it becomes too rigid, too strict, or on the other hand, when it's completely lacking, when it's missing, both these situations are very pathological, and they lead to a collapse in self-control. Self-control is the ability to be in command of one's behavior, overt, covert, emotional, physical, and to restrain oneself and to inhibit one's impulses, impulse control. And so when short-term gain is pitted against long-term greater gain, self-control is the ability to opt for the longer-term outcome. So self-control is intimately connected with the notion of time. And indeed, in borderline and narcissism, there's no time, or in other cases like bipolar and so on, time is cyclical. There's no long-term and short-term. There's no term at all. Impulsiveness results if short-term is the equivalent of long-term, because they're both non-existent. The outcome is impulsiveness. And there's no self-discipline. There's no control of one's impulses and desires. Freud would have said that the id takes over and the ego is kind of relinquished or abandoned. And so there's immediate satisfaction in favor, immediate satisfaction instead of delayed gratification or longer term goals. Immediate gratification is the experience of satisfaction or the receipt of a reward as soon as a response is made. And adults and healthy people delay this. They delay gratification because they forego immediate reward in order to obtain a larger, more desired, more pleasurable, bigger reward in the future. There's a concept of the future. There's a horizon. There's ability to extrapolate, to predict. There's a theory. Isn't it a working model of the world, a theory of mind of other people, mentalization? All this is missing. And because all this is missing, everything is immediate, everything is reflexive, everything is responsive, everything is reactive, and it gives no place and no rise to self-regulation, to regulatory mechanisms to operate, because regulation by definition is the ability to suspend immediate responsiveness, immediate reactance, and immediate gratification in favor of longer-term outcomes, internal or external. That's a great definition of regulation. Regulation is about not doing what you want the minute you want to do it. Regulation is about not falling to pieces when you're confronted with a challenge or a difficulty or hardship. Regulation is about not giving in to your infantile and primitive side, imposing on it the strictures and the benefits of social structure as embedded in your higher levels of the mind, especially the adult parts. And there's no such thing in mentally ill people. Freud would have said that in mentally ill people, the pleasure principle prevails over the reality principle. Let me explain this a bit. The pleasure principle is a view that human beings are governed by desires, by drives, by urges for gratification, for pleasure, for the discharge of tension that builds up as pain. When there is internal dissonance or conflict or tension between what you want and what you cannot get, what you want and what society tells you you shouldn't pursue, when there are these tensions, the discharge of the tension is by pursuing pleasurable things, pleasurable objects, pleasurable experiences, pleasurable activities, pleasurable people. It's um, a discharge of the tension, because the tension is experienced as painful or unpleasant when gratification is lacking. So in classical psychoanalytic theory, Sigmund Freud said that the pleasure principle is a force. It's a psychic force, and it motivates people to seek immediate gratification of instinctual, libidinal impulses, sex, hunger, thirst, elimination even, and so on. The pleasure principle dominates the id, operates most strongly during childhood, and later in adulthood. It is opposed by the reality principle as embedded and enshrined in the ego. And this is the pleasure-pain principle versus the reality principle. I'm not necessarily an adherent of all these structures, id, ego, and so on. I think they're metaphors, they're not realities. But I think the dichotomy or the contradiction between pleasure and reality is real. And I think it's a very interesting organizing principle. The reality principle, in classical psychoanalytic theory at least, is the regulatory mechanism. This is regulation. It represents the demands of the external world, and it requires the individual to forego or to modify instinctual gratification, to postpone it to a more appropriate time. It is unlike the pleasure principle, because the pleasure principle is dominant and, as I said, governs the id, the instinctual impulses. The reality principle governs the ego and controls impulses. Reality principle enables people to deal rationally, effectively, and in the long term with the situations and exigencies of life. And it leads to something called self-regulated learning. Self-regulated learning is a process. We continuously monitor and control our learning. We observe everything in every human being, healthy or unhealthy. There is a monitoring agency, a surveillance agency, the NSA, the internal NSA. It's a kind of agency that observes, records, monitors, and so on. So this is a crucial part of self-regulation. Self-regulated learning involves metacognition, cognitive control, motivation, and a strategic use of learning and learned behaviors. And metacognition is the awareness of one's own cognitive processes. I would even say the awareness of one's own emotions, if we adhere to the belief that emotions are cognitive processes. And it involves a conscious attempt to control these emotions and these cognitions. And so metacognition is crucial, and it's missing in borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. They're unable to stand outside themselves, to stand aside and watch themselves and observe themselves as neutrally and objectively as humanly possible. They don't do this. They go with the flow. It's as if they're diving all the time. They never emerge to survey or to look at the landscape. They're constantly underwater. The internal experience of narcissists and borderlines is like they're underwater all the time. And they have to survive somehow underwater. And they are struggling with breathing and other kinds of functions and so on and so forth, just in order to survive. And they have no time for regulation, because everything is in the present, in a bad way. Not mindfulness, but in a bad way. Everything is immediate. Everything is impulsive. Everything is exigent. So everything is the here and now. And when everything is the here and now, you cannot develop a theory of yourself. You cannot see yourself. You cannot, of course, regulate yourself. This presentism, this immersion in the here and now as a threat, the here and now as an exigency, the here and now as a vicissitude. This is what undermines any attempt at self-regulation or regulatory process inside the borderline and the narcissist. this lack of time. They're frozen like ants in amber. I keep telling you, Shoshanim and Shoshanot, that narcissists are incapable of positive emotions, like love or even joy. And they are incapable of positive emotions because they have no access to them. They have firewalled positive emotions, repressed them, buried them. And the reason they do this is because they have learned to associate positive emotions with negative outcomes, for example, hurt or pain. Now, narcissists, on the other hand, are perfectly capable of negative affects, negative emotions such as anger, fear, and of course, envy. The strange thing is that self-styled experts and even scholars in academia dispute these assertions. And why is it strange? Not only because they disagree with moi, with me, which is shocking in itself, but because they disagree with the literature. They disagree with the diagnostic manuals. For example, the International Classification of Diseases, edition 11, clearly states that one of the pillars of pathological narcissism is negative affectivity. Similarly, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual includes envy as a diagnostic criterion for narcissistic personality disorder. Negative affects play a major role in pathological narcissism. And when the narcissist is confronted with repeated injuries, narcissistic mortification, or narcissistic collapse, the narcissist is very likely to dysregulate, very likely to become emotionally dysregulated, similar to a borderline. In all this landscape, the narcissist is denied the comfort, soothing, um, and warm embrace of positive emotions and the rich panoply of dimensions and artifacts that emanate from positive emotions. I've received a comment and it read, "Dear Professor," that's me, "what is the difference between having positive emotions and not having access to them internally in the case of NPD? Does the narcissistic person acknowledge the presence of positive emotions within?" The answer to the second question is no. If you have no access to your positive emotions and you never experience positive emotions, then of course you cannot acknowledge the presence of positive emotions. However, narcissists mislabel many psychological dynamics and lived experiences as emotions. They are not. For example, the narcissist euphoric and phases in the shared fantasy, the narcissist elation when he finds a mother substitute, is misperceived and mislabeled by the narcissist as love. The narcissist is likely to say, "Of course I'm in love. Of course I experience love. I've experienced love many times, and my love is deep and profound." My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love and Narcissism Revisited, and I'm a professor of psychology. And I suggest that we could conceive of narcissistic personality disorder as an emotional disability or emotional developmental disorder. We have in the DSM and in clinical texts, we have intellectual disability. It's intellectual developmental disorder. That's a condition characterized by significant limitations in cognitive functioning, such as learning, problem solving, reasoning. And the kind of adaptive behaviors, conceptual, social, practical life skills that appear before age 22 and do not make an appearance in intellectual disability. Similarly, I would like to redefine pathological narcissism as a form of emotional disability where adaptive behaviors fail to appear and there are serious limitations on emotional functioning. One of the most prominent scholars in this field is Sarah Walker. She is assistant professor of educational psychology in Durham University. And I want to describe her work today because I think it's Very pertinent and very important, and regrettably, it's not known well enough. It doesn't inform the opinions and the professional education of many a scholar and many an academic. Yes, even in academe, ignorance reigns very often. Okay, before we go there, we need to make a distinction between grandiose narcissists and vulnerable narcissists. Unfortunately, these are the labels used in clinical literature. These labels are wrong because all narcissists are simultaneously grandiose and vulnerable. However, it is true that some narcissists are predominantly overt, and where overt narcissists are mostly grandiose, and some narcissists are predominantly covert, and covert narcissists are mostly fragile or vulnerable. It is equally true that all narcissists go through phases in life. At times they are overt and at times they are covert. It is the statistical test. How often are they overt and how often are they covert that determines the type. Okay, a person with narcissistic traits may be bold, has high level of grandiosity, which is a cognitive distortion, may be overconfident and emotionally resilient. Another type of narcissist could be defensive, anxious, and hypersensitive to criticism. These distinctions were made by Akhtar and Cooper mainly in 1989 and then Wink in 1991, and they stayed with us to this very day. Both these types of narcissists show signs of narcissistic self-focus and attempts to self-enhance and a largely infantile, fantastic, grandiose self-concept. But they end up looking quite different in how they experience and how they express emotions. And that's where we come to the work of Walker. In 2022, Walker published a research paper together with a few colleagues. And what she did, or what they did, is a meta-analysis. They examined how narcissistic traits relate to the ability to control emotions, to regulate them. Now, regulating emotions is not the same as experiencing them. But if regulation, or when regulation becomes rigid, when regulation becomes all-pervasive, when regulation becomes the goal, the end, not the means, then we have inaccessibility of emotions. In that case, we have a situation where the emotions are firewalled because there is an underlying fear of dysregulation. This kind of narcissist, or all narcissists actually, they prefer to not emote, to not experience feelings and affects. People with high scores on vulnerable narcissism scales are more likely to rely on suppression. Suppression is a strategy. It means that people hide or inhibit emotional expressions, affect display. They may appear to be numb or emotionless or cold or detached or robotic. And that's very common in schizoid personalities and schizoid personality disorder, where suppression is a key strategy. And suppression has been linked to poor well-being. The more you suppress your emotions, the less likely you are to be egosyntonic, the less likely you are to feel good with yourself and to be happy, let alone go lucky. On the surface, suppression may sound like self-control, but it is the exact opposite. It is the outcome of phobia, the outcome of panic. It's essentially an anxiety reaction. There is an anticipation and catastrophizing of what emotions may do to you, and then you suppress them. You'd rather not experience them. When this becomes a lifelong strategy, what we have is pathological narcissism. So, it's always good to keep a lid on your emotions. This is known as sometimes as impulse control. Not expressing your emotions, not verbalizing them, and definitely not using them to attack people. Muting emotional expression. But if you do this and you do not address the underlying emotions, if you if your way of regulating your emotions is not experiencing them at all, it actually increases stress. When this is the default strategy, anxiety ensues, and this kind of suppression worsens mental and physical health over time. In grandiose narcissism, studies haven't found a link with difficulties in emotional regulation. Several of the studies um, suggested that people with higher levels of grandiose traits do not experience emotional distress. And that is further proof of what I'm saying. They don't experience emotional distress because they don't experience emotions. And the emotions they do experience, like rage or like envy, or they perceive these emotions as proof of omnipotence, as empowering emotions. When they hate someone, when they envy someone and want to destroy them, when they are angry at someone, they feel stronger, empowered, omnipotent. This challenges the popular idea that people who exhibit narcissistic tendencies also experience emotional instability. Scholars who claim this confuse NPD with BPD, with one exception mentioned: narcissistic mortification, narcissistic collapse, narcissistic injuries. All challenges to the self-concept lead typically to decompensation and the equivalent of acting out or acting in, suicidal ideation, depression, or some reckless type of behavior. All kinds of challenges to the integrity and the godlike qualities of the false self usually result in emotional dysregulation, mood lability, and so on, and the narcissist comes to resemble someone with borderline personality organization. Okay, back to the work of Walker. Walker therefore makes a distinction between what she calls grandiose narcissist and vulnerable narcissist. Again, it's very wrong to use these labels because all narcissists are vulnerable and grandiose. I think she would have been better off calling them overt and covert. And she conducted, with other researchers, she conducted studies of emotional intelligence. In 2021, there was a systematic review on narcissism and emotional intelligence, and she and her colleagues found that people with grandiose traits often said that they were good at understanding and managing emotions, counterfactually. These people, grandiose people, they thought, they believed that they could handle anger and they could read other people's emotions with a high degree of confidence. But when their skills were tested using emotion tasks, for example, when they were asked to recognize facial expressions or to identify the best way to respond to an emotional situation, their performance did not match up with how skilled they said they were. It was kind of emotional Dunning-Kruger effect with grandiose narcissists or overt narcissists. This was very consistent with another earlier study in 2018. That study found that people with grandiose tendencies rated themselves as emotionally skilled, but performed worse on skill-based emotional intelligence tasks compared to other participants and the general population, the control group. How about covert narcissists, people with vulnerable narcissistic traits, statistically speaking? They tend to rate themselves lower in emotional intelligence. They seem to genuinely struggle with managing emotions in everyday life. In this sense, covert narcissists resemble borderlines much more than overt narcissists. So, what can we make of Walker's work? Um, Narcissism is a compounded phenomenon, and Walker acknowledges it in her work. It's a complex psychological pattern. It can show up in different ways at different times. It can reflect struggles, deep struggles, with things such as implicit self-esteem versus explicit compensatory self-esteem, emotion regulation versus dysregulation, social connection versus schizoid, avoidant tendencies. It's very multifaceted. Understanding pathological narcissism is not the same as justifying it or excusing people's bad behavior. Not at all. I've been advocating for accountability for narcissists for decades. But it does help us to look past stereotypes. When we obtain a clear picture of what narcissists are, we begin to realize that these people have limited access to reality, their internal reality as well as their external reality. They're very detached. And Otto Kernberg presciently suggested this when he postulated that narcissistic and borderline disorders are essentially points on a spectrum and that they're poised on the verge of psychosis. In all these situations, the denial of emotions, the burying of emotions, the sequestration of emotions is a critical strategy of for survival. It's an adaptation. Initially, it's a positive adaptation, as the child is overwhelmed by adverse circumstances, and the only way to survive this is to not feel anything. But lifelong, in adulthood and later, it's maladaptation, becomes a maladaptation, because not only because feeling love is great, I'm told, but also because if you can't do emotions, you're not likely to be able to read other people accurately. You're not likely to grasp social cues correctly. You're likely to misbehave inadvertently. And so emotions are guideposts. Emotions calibrate us. Emotions tell us what's permissible and what's not. What we call conscious is emotionally infused. There's no memory without emotions, no continuous memory. Consequently, narcissists are highly dissociative. The lack of positive emotions or access to positive emotions undermines the cohesion, coherence, and functionality of the narcissist personality. They feel bad about it very often. Narcissists are frequently depressed and anxious. But instead of attempting to mine positive emotions courageously, to be willing to embrace loss and the ultimate price of vulnerability and exposing yourself to new experiences, instead of all this, what the narcissist does, the narcissist lashes out. The narcissist seeks to control, sadistically punish people. It's very punitive, and so on. And so the narcissist is self-referential in this sense, will never exit the circle of hell in which a narcissist is forever entrapped. I'm Sam Vaknin, and I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. Do narcissists have emotions? Of course they do. Everybody has emotions. It is how we choose to relate to our emotions that matters. The narcissist tends to repress emotions so deeply that for all practical purposes they play no conscious role in his life or in his conduct. But his emotions play an inordinately and extraordinarily large unconscious role. The narcissist's positive emotions come bundled with very negative ones. This is the outcome of frustration and the consequent transformations of aggressions that the narcissist experiences in early childhood. This frustration is connected to the parents and caregivers of the narcissist. Instead of being provided with the unconditional love that he craved, the narcissist was subjected to totally unpredictable and inexplicable bouts of temper, rage, searing sentimentality, envy, prodding, infusion of guilt, and other unhealthy parental emotions, control, and behavior patterns. The narcissist reacted by retreating into his private world, where he deemed himself omnipotent and omniscient and therefore immune to such vicious vicissitudes. The narcissist stashed his vulnerable true self in a deep mental cellar and outwardly presented to the world a false self, omnipotent and omniscient. But bundling positive and negative emotions is far easier than unbundling them. The narcissist is unable to evoke positive feelings without provoking negative ones. Gradually, he becomes phobic. He is afraid to feel anything, lest it be accompanied by some fearsome, guilt-inducing, anxiety-provoking, out-of-control emotional complements. The narcissist is reduced to experiencing dull stirrings in his soul that he identifies to himself and to others as emotions. Even these are felt only in the presence of someone or something capable of providing the narcissist with his badly needed drug, narcissistic supply. Only when the narcissist is in the overvaluation, the idealization phase of his relationships, does he experience the convulsions that he prefers to call feelings. These are so transient and fake that they are easily replaced and substituted for by rage, envy, and devaluation. The narcissist really recreates the behavior patterns of his less than ideal parents. Deep inside, the narcissist knows that something is amiss. He does not empathize with other people's feelings. He holds them in contempt and ridicule. He cannot understand how people are so sentimental, so irrational. He identifies being rational with being cool-headed and cold-blooded. Often the narcissist believes that other people are faking it, merely aiming by displaying emotion to achieve a goal. He is convinced that their feelings are grounded in ulterior, non-emotional motives. He becomes suspicious, paranoid, embarrassed, feels compelled to avoid emotion-tinged situations, or worse, experiences surges of almost uncontrollable aggression in the presence of genuinely expressed emotions and sentiments. These, the emotions and sentiments, remind him of how imperfect and poorly equipped he is to deal with life. The weaker variety of narcissist tries to emulate and simulate emotions, or at least their external facet, their expression, their appearance, what we call affect. These narcissists mimic and replicate the intricate pantomime that they learn to associate with the existence of feelings in others. But there are no real emotions there, no emotional correlate inside the narcissist. This is empty affect, devoid of emotion. This being so, the narcissist quickly tires of it. He becomes impassive and begins to produce inappropriate affect. For instance, he remains indifferent when grief is the normal reaction. The narcissist subjects his feigned emotions to his cognition. He decides that it is appropriate to feel this way or that. His emotions are invariably the result of analysis, goal setting, and planning. He substitutes remembering for sensing. He relegates his bodily sensations, feelings, and emotions to a kind of memory vault. The short and medium-term memory is exclusively used to store his reactions to his actual and potential narcissistic supply sources. The narcissist reacts in general only to such sources. The narcissist finds it hard to remember or recreate what he ostensibly, though ostentatiously, felt even a short while back towards a narcissistic source of supply once it has ceased to be a source of supply. In his attempts to recall his feelings, the narcissist draws a mental blank. It is not that narcissists are incapable of expressing what we would tend to classify as extreme emotional reactions. They mourn, they grieve, they rage, they smile, they excessively love and care. But this is precisely what sets them apart. This rapid movement oscillation from one emotional extreme to another, and the fact that they never occupy the emotional middle ground. The narcissist is especially emotional when weaned off his drug of narcissistic supply. Breaking a habit is always difficult, especially one that defines and generates oneself. Getting rid of an addiction is doubly taxing. The narcissist misidentifies this crisis, this cold turkey phase, with an emotional depth, and his self-conviction is so immense that he mostly succeeds to delude other people as well. But a narcissistic crisis, losing a source of narcissistic supply, obtaining an alternative one, moving from one narcissistic pathological space to another, all these crises must never be confused with the real thing, which the narcissist never experiences, true emotions. Many narcissists have emotional resonance tables. They use words as others use algebraic signs, with meticulousness, with caution, with the precision of the artisan. The narcissist sculpts in words the fine-tuned reverberations of pain and love and fear. It is a mathematics of emotional grammar. the geometry of the syntax of passions. Devoid of all true emotions, narcissists closely monitor people's reactions. They adjust their verbal choices accordingly until their vocabulary resembles that of their interlocutors and listeners. This is as close as the narcissist gets to empathy. To summarize, the emotional life of the narcissist is colorless and eventless, as rigidly blind and as his disorder, as dead as the narcissist is. He does feel rage and hurt and envy and emotional and inordinate humiliation and fear. These negative feelings are very dominant, prevalent, and recurrent use in the canvas of his emotional existence. But there is nothing there except these atavistic gut reactions. Whatever it is that the narcissist experiences as emotions, he experiences in reaction to slights and injuries, real and imagined. His emotions are all reactive, not proactive. He feels insulted, he sulks. He feels devalued, he rages. He feels ignored, he pouts. He feels humiliated, he lashes out. He feels threatened, he fears. He feels adored, he basks in glory. He is virulently envious of one and all. The narcissist can appreciate beauty, but in a cerebral, cold, and mathematical way. Many narcissists have no mature, adult sex drive to speak of. Their emotional landscape is dim and gray, as though looking through a glass darkly. Many narcissists can intelligently discuss those emotions never experienced by them, like empathy or love, because they make it a point to read a lot and to communicate with people who claim to be experiencing these emotions. Thus, they gradually construct working hypotheses as to what people feel and how they feel. As far as the narcissist is concerned, it is pointless to try to really understand emotions, but at least these models he does form allow him to better predict people's behavior and to adjust to them. Narcissists are not envious of others for having emotions. They disdain feelings and sentimental people because they find them to be weak and vulnerable, and they deride human frailties and vulnerabilities. Such derision makes the narcissist feel superior and is probably the ossified remains of a defense mechanism gone awry. Narcissists are afraid of pain. It is the pebble in their indra's net. Lift it and the whole net unravels. Their pains do not come isolated. They constitute families of anguish, tribes of hurt, whole races of agony. The narcissist cannot experience each and every emotion separately, only collectively. Narcissism, in effect, is an attempt to contain the ominous onslaught of stale, negative emotions, repressed rage, in a child's deep-set, irretractable injuries.